Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We are reading the book Fanny Crosby's Memories of 80 Years by Fanny Crosby, and there is no copyright to it. And we are on Chapter 14, Early Songs and Hymns. In 1845, Mr. George F. Root began to give instruction in music at the institution. Already he was well known as a composer of many sweet hymns and various secular pieces that were exceedingly popular. He used to play many of his melodies for me and frequently asked me to write words for them. One day in 1851, he played an air that was wonderfully sweet and touching, and I exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Root, why don't you publish that?" "I have no words for it," he replied, "and cannot purchase any." I suggested that he let me try to write something. He asserted, and I composed a song beginning as follows. "O come to the greenwood where nature is smiling, O come to the greenwood so lovely and gay. There will be soft music thy spirit beguiling, tenderly carol thy sadness away." Our first joint composition was a song entitled "Fare Thee Well, Kitty Dear," which described the grief of a colored man on the death of his beloved, and the chorus runs like this. "Fare thee well, Kitty dear, thou art sleeping in thy grave so low. Nevermore, Kitty dear, wilt thou listen to my old banjo." During the next 3 years we composed 50 or 60 songs, some of the titles of which were "Bird of the North," "Hazel Dell," and "They Have Sold Me Down the River," "Oh, How Glad to Get Home," "Rosalie, the Prairie Flower," and "There's Music in the Air." The success of the concerts given by William B. Bradbury at the Broadway Tabernacle inspired Mr. Root to attempt something in the same manner, and accordingly we wrote The Flower Queen, a cantata, the story of which is as follows. An old man, becoming tired of the world, decides to become a hermit, but as he's about to retire to his lonely hut, he hears a chorus singing, "Who shall be queen of the flowers?" His interest is at once aroused, and on the following day he is asked to act as a judge in a contest where each flower urges her claims to be the queen of all the others. At length the hermit chooses the rose for her loveliness, and in turn she exhorts him to return to the world and to his duty. I believe that Flower Queen was the first American cantata, and it was immediately in great demand. It was followed by the Pilgrim's Fathers, for which Dr. Lowell Mason assisted in composing the music. On March 2, 1858, I left the New York Institute for the Blind, and my parting from those familiar surroundings was indeed sad, for I had been there nearly 23 years, 8 as a pupil and 15 years as a teacher. Prior to this, I had written no hymns, except possibly 1 or 2 short religious poems that may have been set to music. But I had been engaged in writing verses and short prose sketches for several papers. The best of my work had been collected into 3 books, although the great bulk of personal and miscellaneous pieces were never gathered together, and I am indeed glad that they were not. The 3rd book of poems was compiled a few months after I left the institution, under the title of A Wreath of Columbia Flowers, and it suffered more than the others from the need of careful pruning and revision. In 1858, I was married to Mr. Alexander Van Alstyne, whom I had known as a pupil and a teacher in the Institute for almost 15 years. By nature, he was endowed with superior musical ability, and before he graduated from our school, he was said to be one of the most accomplished students that we ever had there. He continued his education in Union College, where in addition to the music he studied classics and theology, and then he taught at Albany, New York, until 1855, when he returned to teach in our school, which he continued to do with rare skill and sympathy with his pupils for 3 years. After our marriage, he insisted that my literary name should remain as it had become known to the public in general through my poems. He composed the music to several of my hymns, besides constantly aiding me with kind criticism and advice. At different times, he was an organist in 2 of the New York churches and also taught private classes in both vocal and instrumental music. He was a firm, trustful Christian and a man whose kindly deeds and cheering words will not be forgotten by many of his friends. We were happy together many years. His death occurred on July 18th, 1902. As early as 1860, the name of William B. Bradbury was familiar to all lovers of music. To the Christian world, he was known principally as the author of a large collection of sweet melodies, many of which have found their way into the best collection of hymns. Prior to 1864, I had never met this gifted composer, but I had often fancied that our tastes might be congenial, and on this account, I was somewhat anxious to make his acquaintance. The opportunity to do so soon came through Reverend Peter Steichler, the minister of the Dutch Reformed Church in 23rd Street, which I frequently attended. In December 1863, Mr. Steichler asked me to write a short poem that could be used as a hymn in the closing service of the year. "Why don't you see Mr. Bradbury? He has told me more than once that he was looking for someone who could write hymns. I think you are the person for whom he has been looking, and I will give you a letter of introduction." In the consequence of this arrangement, on February the 2nd, 1864, I presented myself at the office of William B. Bradbury, 425 Broome Street. To my surprise, Mr. Bradbury said, "Fanny, I thank God that we have met at last, for I think you can write hymns, and I have wished for a long time to have a talk with you." At the end of the brief interview, I promised to bring him something before the week drew to a close, and 3 days later I returned with some verses that were soon set to music and published as my first hymn. There are 4 stanzas, and 3 of them I will quote here. We are going to a home beyond the skies, where the fields are robed in beauty and the sunlight never dies, where the fount of joy is flowing in the valley green and fair. We shall dwell in love together. There shall be no parting there. We are going, and the music we have heard, like the echo of the woodland or the carol of the bird. The following week, Mr. Bradbury sent for me in great haste. He said that he wanted a patriotic song at once. As a title, he chose "A Song Among the Mulberry Trees," but I timidly suggested that "Forest Trees" would be much more euphonious, to which idea he at once assented. The melody that he had composed was somewhat difficult, but having heard it 2 or 3 times, I was able to count the measure, and the words were then easily adapted. On the following morning, I carried the song to the office of Mr. Bradbury, but he was not there, and so his bookkeeper, who was also a musical man, played it on the piano, exclaiming, "How in the world did you manage to write that hymn? Nobody ever supposed that you or any mortal could attempt words to that melody." At that moment, Mr. Bradbury entered the office, and after looking over the hymn very carefully, turned to me and exclaimed, "Fanny, I am surprised beyond measure. Now let me say that as long as I have a publishing house, you will always have work." The future verified his promise, for I have been with Mr. Bradbury and his successors, the Bigelow and Maine Company, more than 40 years. And that's the end of Chapter 14. Next time will be Chapter 15, The Life of a Hymn Writer. I love you, I'm praying for you, and bye-bye for now.